Oh, Baldur's Gate 3 has cut content? I'm sure it's not that much. What in the 9 gates of hell? Ladies, gentlemen, and adventurers of all ages, the more I dig down into the dirt, the more Baldur's Gate 3 content I find. It's like this beautiful mansion of a game with a number of strange, unmarked graves in the backyard that no one's allowed to talk about. But we should talk about it because as time goes on, more and more information about things that aren't actually in the game at this point is popping up in the community. And there's just so much that it's a bit staggering. 2 quick disclaimers before we dive into it all then. First, there will be spoilers in here, it's just how it is. There isn't anything completely mind-shattering, but spoilers for some companion story endings and similar aspects of the game. The second disclaimer then, as well, this is cut content, and there is a lot of it. Baldur's Gate 3 is, as it is, a masterpiece of a game. It has faults, of course, as you especially get closer to the end, and the cut content could arguably be labeled as a major fault as well. But if the vision that Larian had for this, as of this moment, is the game that we got, and we all love it as much as we do, it's hard to argue with their decision. Especially, remember that this is a Larian game here, and they have a tendency to release definitive editions for their games. I bet you a year down the line we get Baldur's Gate 3 definitive with at least the majority of the cut content that I'm about to talk about today, as well as a ton of other stuff too, and when they do this, it's always free. So take all this with a big grain of salt, as well all of this is currently cut content. It's all stuff that could eventually return to the game, at least most of it. That said, let's dive on into all the things that we know to be confirmed as cut content then. First, I want to show this just because of its ridiculous length. This is a video that someone compiled of all of the cut content Wither's ending monologue audio files. Every one of these is in the files of the released game, but are unused. There are 56 minutes of this. 56 minutes of unused epilogue audio files, each of them only a few lines, so there's just so many different iterations of this. It implies to me that there were originally planned to be quite a few more variations of endings that they just decided against having in the full game. Like a ridiculous number more. This is 56 minutes of audio. So that's the big thing number one. Tons of ending variations that were just cut, or at least the unique epilogue audio that was tied to them. Then the next biggest deal is the whole upper city area in Act 3. One of the main developers on the game said in an interview only 2 weeks before the launch of the game that there was a whole affluent upper city area in Act 3 that you could completely explore, and yeah, that is just not here. We don't have that at all. A whole potentially large portion of the game missing from this act, and it's not the only one either. The upper city would be awesome to explore though, so hopefully it does come back someday because it's a cool concept. It's just the type of area that is so unique from everything else in the game, really. Then we also have Avernus. You know, that literally hell that we flew out of in the Nautiloid at the start of the game, that place that Karlach is from? Yeah, there are files to suggest that Avernus was also a full area later on in the game that you could visit, one with particularly challenging fights, and of course specific parts of Karlach's story that got cut from the game that would have been there too. Speaking of which, Karlach's good ending. It's been all but confirmed that the actual good proper ending of Karlach's companion quests is simply not in the game at the moment. It is cut content as a whole. It required specific steps in areas that were cut content, being Avernus and the upper city, so instead of moving those steps, they actually just completely cut that ending entirely, which again is the good ending. It's the proper ending, the one that wraps things up. Every companion ending that we have for Karlach now is considered a wrong ending, which is just really weird, honestly. And that's not it for companions either. Minthara had a ton of story that was cut, including a whole pregnancy section, which is obviously a crazily deep thing to just cut completely. Then also Halsin had his story cut quite a bit too. Obviously these are companions that were added to the game later on, but it is still disappointing to actually learn there was so much more planned for these two. Also, they got the ability to sleep with Jaheira, just putting it out there in case you're interested. But if you'd prefer to keep it in your pants, what about belts? This post said it simpler than I ever could. There was an item slot in the game in early access for belts. There aren't any currently, and never actually were any belts in the game, ever. That all in itself is extremely odd. Obviously the slot has been removed for actual launch of the game, there's no more belt slot, but in early access the slot was there, and they never even put a belt in. I can understand why a belt slot would be hard to manage, but then why did they put the slot there? It's still just really unusual that they had it there so much of the early access, but never even tried to add any belts to the game. Perhaps this could come back in a definitive edition type thing one day, as a whole new slot would actually be a really wonderful place to play around with adding new equipment in it too, with tons of unique effects. The next one is actually quite a sizable thing to take out as well, which is the consequences related to tadpoles and illithid powers. All throughout the game you are given the option of using illithid powers to make yourself stronger, but also told that it will come at a price. There are points like at the end of Act 2 where you can choose to interact even further with your illithid side, and theoretically choosing to do this would be just asking for some kind of punishment or interaction from the game, right? It keeps talking about it and says it'll come, and yet it just doesn't. In the actual released version of the game, there are never any real actual consequences from using your illithid powers. It has no effect on the ending that you get for the story either, which is again really just sort of odd. In the story, the dialogue, they just make such a a big deal about the potential consequences of this, only to have not put any of them in the game itself. An interesting and probably related one to that, though, is the mind shielding ring item that you can get from Omalum in the Myconid colony in the Underdark. They make a whole big deal in the dialogue about how this ring can stop your illithid transformation, not reverse it, but halt it. And in early access, this ring would full-on block your tadpole, not letting you use any powers, not letting you interact with it at all. And of course, in a world where with real consequences for tadpole usage, that would actually be quite a useful item. But in the full game, this concept was cut, and while all the dialogue remains and the item description itself is also unchanged, the ring now does none of those actual things. On the topic of equipment, how do you feel about Raphael, the totally normal guy who isn't a devil by any means, actually being a vendor? Not only being able to actually remove your tadpole to you, which was a part of him beforehand, but also being a vendor for a number of powerful items. Definitely an interesting thing that could have been. Then we have two more major things left, really. The first of this is separate worship options for certain classes. There was the ability in early access to be a Shar worshipper, and if you were, you had unique dialogue with Shadowheart, of course, as a result. There was also the ability to have Baal, Merkel, and Bane as deity choices for Cleric, which could result in unique dialogue options too, even as, well, obviously, those three entities have some slight story importance in this game. Finally, then, we have something known simply as Daisy, and this will mean nothing to anyone who only started playing after the full release of the game. Originally, and for a very long time, the Guardian character who lives inside of the Astral Prism didn't exist. Instead, the character who talked directly into your mind was called Daisy, essentially a representation of the tadpole that is in your head itself. Basically, this was an in-game representation of the struggle to not turn into a mind flayer against the will of the tadpole, constantly being lulled into a sense of complacency and acceptance by the tadpole that's affecting your mind, to the point that there was originally an ending that you could do where you could literally just end the game, go off and live in this dream world with your consciousness in there with Daisy while your body becomes a mind flayer. Aside from this, there's just a number of smaller things that were cut from the game too, mostly just proper encounters, like Banite cultists as an enemy, who theoretically would have been part of the upper city area, which was cut as a whole entirely. The Nautiloid area, the tutorial area at the very beginning of the game, was also supposed to be a bit bigger and have another fight in it. The Hag Coven was supposed to be a stable entity in the entire area of the game that was consistently involved in things in every act, with a side story climax and everything, and then just a number of things with Orin as well, which could have added to her. Well, let's say her aura is the right word for that, probably, and that's more or less it, everyone. All of the currently confirmed cut content from early access or from data mine files in the full game, and there's absolutely a lot of it. So what do we make of all this? Is the game worse because they cut all these things out that would have been cool? Well, it sounds like there were a ton of ideas around the place that they were working around and trekking out, but they did what they thought was right to produce a cohesive game that made sense from start to finish. I think there are definitely arguments that could be made if the game was developed for another year instead of releasing now. Most of these things likely would have been in the game proper, at least the ones that are just continuations, but clearly Larian made the choices they did for a reason. Whether that reason is good or not is entirely up to us as players to decide, but it was definitely a conscious choice that they made. That said, there's also something a bit related to all of this that I did want to talk about, which is an article from Forbes from a couple of days ago, written as a reaction to how insanely high the review scores are for Baldurs Gate 3, titled 2 Warnings About Baldurs Gate 3 Review Scores, which is quite the start, honestly. At the time of the article, the game was rated similarly to Tears of the Kingdom on Metacritic, and in response to this, they had 2 warnings for players before they headed in. The first one is, there are no plans for expansions. That is sort of just silly to me as a thing to complain about. The game is absolutely massive. There is so much to do, and you want to warn people that there are no expansions planned at the time of launch? Is that really even a concern? Not to mention, as I said earlier in the video, Larian has a tendency to release definitive editions of their games a little bit afterwards, with tons of bonus content that you don't even have to pay for. And even aside from that being a thing with how well the game is done, it's also entirely possible they do choose to release a full-on paid expansion eventually. The idea that at launch of the game there was no expansions planned is a concern. That's just crazy to me. Why would that be a problem? Then we have warning number 2. Act 3 is a total mess, and well, they have a bit of a point here to begin with. The vast majority of the cut content I was just talking about was in Act 3. Performance of the game in general drops massively in Act 3 as well. It just runs worse. There are more bugs in Act 3 than anywhere else. All that kind of stuff matters, especially when you get into the whole thing with the endings of the game, which I won't spoil here directly, but let's just say that there is far less choice and variation resolution in the actual ending than you might think there would be. And yeah, that does disappoint a bit after the masterpiece that leads up to Act 3. I can agree with that, but you have to keep in mind the context that this is supposed to be like a warning about the game, in an article designed to say, hey, you about to click that purchase button, maybe read this first and I might change your mind. In other words, it's here to say things that it thinks would be important enough to potentially turn people away from trying Baldur's Gate 3. And while I agree that these things in this article are worth discussing, in no way do I believe that the state of Act 3, when Larian has committed to post-release patches and everything, is a good reason to tell someone not to even bother playing the game in the first place. I mean, you can get to 100 hours before even hitting Act 3 if you really dive into it all. So I just can't agree with the idea that Act 3 torpedoes the quality of the rest of the game, especially when the first point in this article was about a lack of expansion plans. It's just a really weird article to read, really, as someone who's played quite a bit of this game right now. And that'll do it then, everyone. Just some news going over all of the cut content in the game, some of it easy to re-add in the future patches to the game if they choose to when it's fixed up, some of it a lot more deeper choices with the story itself, and even changes to how players could create their characters and roleplay as well. Then of course we talked about an article warning people about the game, which was just a bit of a wild experience to read, honestly. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown, and of course let us know your thoughts on all of this in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.